Regret isn't about what you did. It's about what you assumed you'd always have time for. And there is a very specific difference between those two things. What you did, you can usually explain, even defend. What you assumed you'd always have time for, that's the quieter kind of regret, the one that doesn't show up until the exact moment you find out you were wrong. 8 rules. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you haven't technically heard some version of before. But together, they explain why so many people, often decades into their lives, arrive at almost the exact same realization, usually phrased some version of "I wish someone had actually made me understand this sooner," about things that were true the entire time, quietly waiting to be noticed. Stay with me until rule number 8, because number 8 is the one that ties all 7 of the others together, the single thread running underneath every version of this regret, in every life it eventually shows up in. Without understanding it, the other 7 are just separate pieces of advice. With it, they become one coherent way of actually living. But first, rule number 3 is the one that's going to surprise you, because it's not really advice at all. It's the naming of a habit so constant, so background, that almost nobody realizes it's something they're actively doing, and that they could simply stop. Let's begin. Most of us assume wisdom arrives with age automatically, that if we just live long enough, the important lessons will simply accumulate on their own, learned gradually through experience. Some of them do. But a striking number of the most commonly cited late-life realizations aren't things people needed decades of experience to learn. They're things that were true and available the entire time, just never named clearly enough, early enough, to actually change how someone lived. Japan has several concepts that speak directly to this gap between what's true and what's noticed in time. There's mono no aware, a gentle, bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of things, cultivated deliberately rather than left to arrive only through loss. And there's ichigo ichii, the recognition that this exact moment, this exact version of a relationship or a day or an opportunity, will never occur again in quite the same way. Both concepts exist specifically to pull forward a kind of awareness that, left alone, tends to arrive only in hindsight, once it's too late to act on it. 8 rules. Each one something research on end-of-life reflection and long-term life satisfaction has found, again and again, among the things people wish they'd understood sooner. Let's go through every single one. You've probably assumed that a strong relationship, once established, mostly takes care of itself, that the closeness built over years of friendship or family history is durable enough to survive long stretches of neglect without real consequence. Stay with me, because this assumption is one of the most consistently cited regrets in research on end-of-life reflection, and it's almost never framed as a dramatic falling out. It's framed as a slow, quiet drift nobody actively chose. Here's the mechanism. Relationships, much like physical fitness, don't operate on a banked model where past investment protects against present neglect indefinitely. Studies on long-term friendship and family closeness have found that perceived relationship quality correlates far more strongly with recent, ongoing contact and effort than with the total historical depth of the relationship, meaning a 20-year friendship, left unmaintained for several years, doesn't retain its closeness simply because of how long it's existed. The relationship's felt strength is closer to a current, ongoing measurement than a permanent, banked account. Japanese social culture reflects an awareness of this through consistent, small, regular gestures of maintenance, seasonal greetings, deliberate check-ins, small rituals of contact that exist specifically to prevent the kind of long silent gap that, in hindsight, is one of the most common things people wish they'd closed sooner. The shift, the relationship you assume is safe because of its history, is only as strong as its most recent maintenance. And the version of this regret almost nobody sees coming is discovering that fact only once the person on the other end of it is no longer there to close the gap with. That is rule number 1. Now, rule number 2 is where this gets interesting, because it applies the exact same mistaken assumption to something people trust even more blindly than relationships. Most people, particularly in their 20s, 30s, and even 40s, operate on an implicit assumption that health is a baseline you can return to whenever you decide to prioritize it, that the body waits, patiently, ready to respond the moment you finally get serious about it. This assumption holds up reasonably well for a long time. It doesn't hold up forever, and the point where it stops holding up is rarely announced in advance. Here's the mechanism. Many of the physiological processes tied to long-term health, cardiovascular capacity, bone density, muscle mass, metabolic flexibility, decline gradually and, critically, become progressively harder to fully reverse the longer that decline goes unaddressed, compared to how easily the same decline could have been prevented or slowed with far smaller, earlier intervention. This is the specific, well-documented asymmetry behind why this shows up so often as late-life regret. The actual daily cost of prevention was almost always smaller than people assumed, and the actual cost of reversal, once needed, is almost always larger. The broader Japanese emphasis on small, continuous health practices, daily walking built into ordinary errands, modest portion habits, consistent rather than occasional attention to diet, reflects a cultural default toward treating health as something maintained in small doses continuously, rather than something addressed only once a problem has already appeared. The shift, the version of "I'll get serious about my health later" that feels reasonable at 30 becomes, for a significant number of people, one of the most commonly cited regrets by 60, not because the person didn't eventually try, but because the small window where prevention would have cost almost nothing had already quietly closed. That is rule number 2. Now, rule number 3, the one I mentioned at the start. Stay right here, because this is a habit so constant that almost nobody realizes it's a habit at all. Slow down here, because I know what you're thinking, that comparison is just a normal, unavoidable part of being human, not something you can actually opt out of. Here's what research on comparison and life satisfaction has consistently found, and why naming this as an active habit, rather than a passive fact of life, changes what you can actually do about it. Here's the mechanism. Social comparison, particularly the upward kind, measuring your own life against people who appear to be doing better in some specific way, has been repeatedly linked in psychological research to lower life satisfaction, independent of a person's actual objective circumstances. The critical detail most people miss is that this comparison is not a fixed feature of consciousness. It's a habitual cognitive behavior, engaged in dozens of times a day, often completely unconsciously, and like any habitual behavior, it can be noticed, interrupted, and reduced with deliberate practice. The Japanese concept Tanari no Shibafu wa Aoi, the neighbor's grass is greener, names this exact tendency explicitly, which is itself part of the mechanism that helps counteract it. A habit that's been explicitly named and recognized as a habit is measurably easier to interrupt than one that's simply been absorbed as an unquestioned fact of how life feels. The shift, the constant low hum of comparing your life to others, isn't an unavoidable tax on being alive. It's a specific, repeated cognitive habit, running largely unnoticed, and simply recognizing it as an optional behavior, rather than a fixed truth, is most of what it takes to start doing it noticeably less. That is rule number 3. Now, rule number 4, and this one challenges a very specific modern assumption about free time. Most productivity advice focuses almost exclusively on freeing up time, working more efficiently, eliminating waste, protecting your schedule. What that advice rarely addresses is what actually happens to the time once it's been successfully freed, and this gap turns out to be one of the more quietly common late-life regrets. Here's the mechanism. Freed time, left unstructured, doesn't automatically convert into meaningful or restorative time. Research on leisure and well-being has found that unstructured free time, particularly when filled reflexively with low-engagement activities like passive scrolling, correlates weakly or not at all with reported life satisfaction, compared to actively chosen, intentional activities that require some deliberate planning to happen at all. Saving an hour and then spending it reflexively, without ever deciding what it was for, produces almost none of the benefit that same hour would have produced if it had been deliberately allocated towards something that actually mattered. This connects to the deliberate, intentional use of space, including the space of time itself, which treats an open hour not as empty space to be passively filled, but as a resource requiring the same deliberate attention as anything actively scheduled. The shift, the hours you've successfully freed up over the years were never automatically hours well spent, and the specific regret this produces, common enough to be one of the more frequently cited late-life reflections, is realizing how much freed time simply evaporated into nothing, unclaimed by anything that actually mattered, because nobody ever told you that freeing time and spending it well were two completely separate skills. That is rule number 4. Now, rule number 5, and this addresses a pattern most people only recognize in hindsight, long after it's cost them the most. This is a version of Kaizen, continuous improvement through changes too small to feel significant, and it's included here specifically because of how consistently people report understanding this only after decades of the opposite pattern, alternating between intense, motivated bursts and long stretches of nothing at all. Here's the mechanism, and why the margin is larger than intuition suggests. Compounding effects, whether in health, skill, finances, or relationships, accumulate multiplicatively across time, not additively, meaning a small, consistent input sustained for years produces a result disproportionately larger than the same total effort concentrated into occasional, intense bursts with long gaps in between. The intuitive assumption is that effort is effort, regardless of how it's distributed across time. The actual math, in nearly every domain where this has been studied, says otherwise, and the gap between the two approaches widens, not narrows, the longer the comparison window runs. The shift, the years spent alternating between intense motivation and long stretches of nothing, produced far less, cumulatively, than the same total hours would have produced spread consistently and modestly across the same period, a gap most people only fully register once they can look back across enough years to actually see the difference. That is rule number 5. Now, rule number 6, and this one is about permission most people spend years waiting for, unnecessarily. Many people continue obligations, roles, or identities for years past the point they genuinely wanted to, waiting for some external event, someone else's approval, a clean natural stopping point, a sense that stopping would be justified enough, that, in a large number of cases, simply never arrives on its own. Here's the mechanism. This is Dan Sherry, refusing what you don't need, discarding what's excess, applied not to physical objects but to obligations, roles, and identities. The specific block that keeps people stuck here is rarely a genuine practical requirement to continue. It's a felt sense that stopping requires justification substantial enough to present to others, when in most cases, no such external permission is actually required at all. Research on decision regret has found that people are more likely, in retrospect, to regret things they continued too long out of inertia or unclear obligation than they are to regret things they deliberately chose to stop. The shift, the years spent waiting for permission to stop something that had already stopped serving you were, in most cases, years spent waiting for a permission slip that was never actually required. The authority to stop was, the entire time, already yours. That is rule number 6. Now, rule number 7, and this one addresses a specific illusion almost everyone falls for about everyone else. This is one of the more quietly damaging assumptions people carry for years, that composure, visible from the outside, reflects an absence of internal struggle, rather than simply a private, unseen version of the same struggle everyone else is also managing. Here's the mechanism. This is the distinction in Japanese social behavior between taitmei, the public face presented to the world, and han, the private, true feelings underneath it. Every culture has some version of this gap, but naming it explicitly is useful, because the gap itself is the entire source of the illusion. You are constantly comparing your own fully visible han, your private doubts, your unresolved struggles, against everyone else's carefully maintained taitmei, which was never designed to reveal any of that in the first place. Research on social comparison consistently finds that people significantly underestimate how much private difficulty exists behind the composed exteriors of people around them, precisely because that difficulty is, by design, rarely shown. The shift, the years spent feeling uniquely behind, uniquely struggling, while everyone else appeared to have it figured out, were years spent comparing your own unfiltered private experience against other people's edited public one, a comparison that was never actually fair, and never actually true. That is rule number 7. Now, rule number 8, the one I told you at the very start, ties all 7 of the others together. Stay here, because this is the most important thing in this entire video. This last rule isn't a separate piece of advice. It's the thread running underneath every one of the previous 7, and understanding it is what turns this list from 7 scattered regrets into one coherent way of actually living differently, starting now. Here's what I mean. Every rule above describes some version of the same underlying mistake, treating something as available indefinitely, or as mattering only once it reaches some future, more significant form, the relationship once we have more time, health once life slows down, meaningful time once free time exists in abundance, stopping once permission arrives, composure once the struggle is finally resolved. In every case, the actual value was available in the small, ordinary, repeated version, the entire time, and the milestone being waited for was, in most cases, never actually the thing that would have made the difference. This is the direct application of Ichigo Ichi to an entire life rather than a single moment, this exact ordinary Tuesday, this exact unremarkable phone call to someone you love, this exact small walk instead of a drive, this exact quiet hour spent on purpose instead of scrolled through. None of these register as significant in the moment they're happening. Research on retrospective life satisfaction consistently finds that people, looking back, identify an accumulation of small, ordinary, repeated moments as the actual substance of a life well lived, far more often than they identify the milestones they spent the most energy anticipating. The shift: you don't need to wait for the milestone version of any of the previous 7 rules to finally arrive. The ordinary, repeated version, available today, in an unremarkable Tuesday, was never the lesser version waiting to be upgraded. It was, this entire time, the actual thing. That is rule number 8. Here is everything in one breath. Maintain relationships actively, history alone doesn't sustain them. Treat health as continuously maintained, not renewable on demand. Notice comparison as an optional habit, not a fixed truth, and resign from it. Freed time requires the same deliberate effort as scheduled time to actually matter. Small consistent effort, compounded over years, outperforms occasional intensity by a wider margin than it seems. You never needed permission to stop what no longer serves you. Everyone's composed exterior hides a private struggle much like your own. And meaning was always accumulating in the ordinary moment, not waiting in some future milestone. 8 rules. None of them require you to be older, wiser, or further along than you currently are to start living by them. Every single one is available to you today, in whatever ordinary moment you're in right now. The people who arrive at these 8 realizations too late aren't unusually unlucky or unusually careless. They simply never had these 8 things named clearly enough, early enough, to notice they were true the whole time. Now you have them, with plenty of time left to actually use them. So here's what I want from you before you close this video. Right now, tell me in the comments which one of these 8 hits closest to something you've already sensed but never quite put into words. Is it number 1, is there a relationship you've let go quiet, assuming it would just pick back up whenever? Is it number 6, is there something you've been waiting for permission to stop, that you actually never needed permission for at all? Is it number 8, have you been quietly waiting for a milestone that the ordinary version of your life was already delivering? Tell me the number, 1 through 8, in the comments right now, because naming it is the first step, and someone reading your comment might recognize their own quiet, unnamed regret in it and finally decide to act on it today, while there's still time to. If this changed how you think about your own life, send it to the one person you know who deserves to hear this now, rather than discover it too late. They're 8 small realizations away from living the rest of their life a little differently, starting today instead of someday. I'll see you in the next one.